All right, we are going to be talking about macromolecules, and we've already talked about how macromolecules form and carbon and the importance of carbon. Now we're going to talk about each of the different types of macromolecules. So the first one we're going to talk about is carbohydrates, then lipids, then nucleic acids, and proteins. So each of these serve a different function, and carbohydrates are sort of our quick energy, lipids are long-term storage. Um, our nucleic acids are um, have lots of info, so they store genetic information, and protein is very versatile. It can do lots of different things. So the first one we're talking about is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates have, you could probably guess by looking at the name, carbon. You could probably guess that all of these have carbon because carbon's so important. So carbon, hydrate is hydrogen and oxygen together. So when you see hydrate, think hydrogen and oxygen. Think water has H2O and you hydrate with water. So when you see hydrogen and oxygen together. And interestingly enough, in carbohydrates, there's always two hydrogens to every oxygen. So if you think about hydrate, think of water. There's always two hydrogen to one oxygen, H2O, right? So water, that can help you remember that. The monomer unit for carbohydrates are called monosaccharides. Mono means one. And saccharide, you may have heard the term saccharin, think sugar. All monosaccharides have the same formula, C6H12O6. And it's just the structure and how they're put together that makes those monosaccharides different. So, carbohydrates are generally short term energy storage. You store carbohydrates in your muscles. It's called glycogen. If you lift weights or you exercise, you might have heard about glycogen before. And starch you find in plants, and it's where plants store most of their energy. And then also, carbohydrates are part of our cell membranes. They create these chains that we use to communicate with other cells, cell to cell communication. So carbohydrates have lots of functions too, but specifically we think of carbohydrates as that short-term energy storage. That's why before a game you have like a pasta party, right? You carbo load. The next one we're going to talk about is lipids. Lipids also have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They don't really have a formula like carbohydrates do in terms of like 2-to-1 ratio, but they always have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The monomers of lipids are glycerols and fatty acids, and it depends on which fatty acids are there and the order they're in. That determines the type of fat it is. Okay, and a lipid is the same as a fat. The functions of lipids are long-term energy storage. So when organisms are going to hibernate, right, they eat lots of food and they store up lots of fat. So when we have fat on our body is saying, "Oh, we ate too much," or we don't need as many calories, so we're going to store that as long-term energy. They're also structural molecules. So part of our cell membrane is called a phospholipid. So it's got phosphorus and it's lipid, and then our hormones are also considered lipids. Things like earwax, waxes, and oils, those are all considered lipids. Okay. So remember, lipids and fats are the same thing. The next one's nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are where we store genetic information. Nucleic acids are much more complex than sugars and lipids or carbohydrates and lipids. They have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. All of these molecules do. And there's now nitrogen and phosphorus. Okay. The monomer unit of a nucleic acid is called a nucleotide. A nucleotide has three parts. This is a nucleotide right here. A nucleotide has a phosphate. So it's a phosphorus and oxygen's bonded to it. It's got a 5-carbon sugar. In DNA, that's called deoxyribose, and in RNA, it's called ribose. And then it has a nitrogen base. So phosphate sugar, that's what makes this backbone here, or this like structure on the outside. That's sugars and phosphates alternating. And then in the center is your nitrogen bases. Those nitrogen bases in an RNA are single. Over here, one nitrogen base bonds to the other. So you have a double helix in DNA and a single helix in RNA. Nucleic acid's job is to store and transmit genetic information. That's what they do. Okay, so in your cells, you have DNA that stores all of your genetic information. You use RNA to help you make proteins based on the DNA that's in your body. The last thing we're going to talk about is proteins. Proteins are what we use to Sorry, that's my dog. Proteins are structural molecules. Proteins have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, so similar to the nucleic acids, but now we also have sulfur. The monomer unit of a protein is called an amino acid. An amino acid has an amino group, so an N and three hydrogens bonded to it. That's nitrogen, and three hydrogens bonded to it. It has a carboxylic acid group or a carboxyl group. That's a COO group. And then this R chain is what's different. So in every single protein, this R chain is going to be different. Basically, what happens is, depending on what's bonded here, it's a different amino acid. There are only 20 amino acids, and they combine in a variety of ways to make all the different proteins in our body. The purpose of proteins is to build and repair tissues. So when you're lifting weights, you're going to build muscle by you actually tear your muscle, and then proteins, amino acids are going to help to repair those tissues. And when they repair the tissues, they get bigger. Breaking molecules down is the function of an enzyme, and then storing and transporting nutrients. All of those things are the job of proteins. They have lots of important roles in our body. Now, enzymes, like we just talked about, help to speed up chemical reactions by lowering the amount of energy that's needed for that reaction to occur. So just quickly show you a video here.
Cell. Instead, cells rely on proteins called enzymes to kickstart chemical reactions and speed them up, enabling cells to get the most out of the energy sources available to them. Enzymes have a unique way of kickstarting reactions. They work by binding to one or more specific molecules called reactants, or substrates. Binding occurs at a special region on the enzyme called the active site. Once the substrates bind to the active site, they form what's called an enzyme substrate complex. As the enzyme and substrates begin to react, some of the chemical bonds in the substrates begin to weaken, causing them to link together. Eventually, the chemical reactions at the active site lead to the formation of a different molecule. This is referred to as the product. Once the reaction has occurred, the product is released from the active site.
So sometimes enzymes are going to build molecules like you just saw in that video, and sometimes they're used to break them down. So we'll talk a little bit more about enzymes later when we talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. But those four types of macromolecules, carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins, are the four that you need to know. And you'll learn a little bit more about them as we continue to work on this unit.